thing that I tell myself, like from that time, is just because I was different didn't mean that I was dumb.
Welcome to the People Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. Hello and welcome. Today on People Powered Solutions, we welcome Simmer, a seasoned HR professional with over 20 years of expertise in the people development and talent management space. She's worked with organizations like Pinterest, Vodafone, and American Express. As we all know, at People Powered Solutions, we strive to provide tips and tricks to create that unicorn culture, if you will, that happy, positive, productive workplace. Part and parcel of that highly sought after workplace is having a really robust diversity and inclusion strategy. So Simmer, I'm going to now pass the baton to you. Tell us about your journey. What has brought you to do what you do now today?
Yeah, thank you, Lori. I think you and I have talked about it yet, right? Like I moved to this country about 7-8 years ago to be with my husband. And it was a very interesting, I call myself in this in-between space where, my values, my community are back home and I'm trying to acclimatize to this new culture. So I realized very quickly that it's very, very different. Like, what is culture? How do you feel like? I always felt like I don't quite belong in the corporate America. And I wish I had somebody to tell me that time that being different doesn't mean that, you don't fit in. It just means that you bring new perspectives to the table.
Absolutely. You say, just for our listeners' purpose, so you are in the US, right? You're located in the US
now? I'm in the US for the last 7-8 years, but I have a big part of my corporate career in Asia.
Okay, so how about you talk to us a bit about that corporate career?
Yeah, it's been very interesting. I think I fell in love with like training, long story short, my sister was always like a numbers person and she's in finance and I barely passed my math tests. Very early on, I knew that, I wanted to do something with people and I attended this training which changed my life. So I actually started my career with American Express, helping the certification process of people to sell corporate cards.
Okay.
And then moved on to people development, leadership development. I've done a little bit of everything. Performance reviews, which everybody hates.
But are key, right? Everybody hates them, but they're such a powerful tool, I think, and we can come back to that later, but I think a lot of the reasons people hate them is because they don't know how to do them effectively and how to use them to their advantage and use them to really shape that ideal behavior, right?
Exactly.
Sorry, I interjected. Go ahead. Keep going.
No, you're absolutely right. I think with performance reviews, also the whole idea of like bucketing people and, the ratings and competencies are hard, behaviors are hard. A lot of us still don't know like what self-awareness means, what it is. And it's just a different world. But I still think that it's important to your point and we're getting better at it.
Definitely. Maybe we do a whole other episode just on performance reviews and performance management, performance development, and how to do that well. But I'll let you continue. So you're at American Express. You're working, you delve into some leadership development, and you start to really hone in on the fact that you love this people-centric kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. I didn't know that there's so much that goes behind the scenes, like competencies, behaviors, L&D strategy, leadership strategy, coaching, self-awareness, psychometric assessments. Like I just kept learning and I call myself the jack of all trades. I don't know if it's a good thing, but just kept exploring new avenues and I learned so much. And then I reached this fork in the road kind of decision, pretty much like you, Lori, whether I was like, do I want to do corporate work or do I want to take my services elsewhere and, multiply the impact, and hence Glintt Consulting.
Love it. I love it. Absolutely. I like this notion of multiplying your impact. And you talked about Glintt Consulting, that's your leadership development practice, right? Yeah. And it really focuses on emerging leaders, which is something that we don't necessarily see a whole lot of. And on team management, as well as on the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. So maybe that last point, I'm really curious, how it is you work with organizations relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations honestly are still struggling to understand the concept well. And I think I have interacted with all stages in their evolution journey, right? There's some who are like, we don't have a problem. Like that's kind of the denial stage, right? But most organizations, I think, are moving more towards the awareness and understanding, right? Like, what are the different stages? How can we do better? How do we look at the data? What are the surveys? What are our employees telling us and all of that? And then comes the whole integration piece, which is so critical. Like if we want to succeed, we want to attract the best talent, we want to retain them, we want to make them feel valued, we want them to feel like they belong and help them do well. And that's the key to success, really, for any organization.
I agree. And to that point, you mentioned at the onset of this conversation that you often felt like you didn't belong, right? So
Yeah.
would you say that maybe that fueled your passion to want to broaden that impact once you figured out that it can actually be an asset and that you're bringing that alternative perspective, that diversity of perspective to any workplace, and that's an asset ultimately, right?
Absolutely, Laura. You got that so right. I think this is a part of my story, and this is what I bring to the table. This is who I was like 7 years ago. I was this lost person trying to understand the ways of working in corporate America. I remember I was interviewing while I was pregnant, and this lady asked me, like, she said something like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it sounded so traumatizing. I was like, what does this even mean? And I had to Google it, and I had to like call my sister-in-law, and I'm like, this sounds very like, what does this mean? So and then people would talk about like the music, like Hollywood music. And the only person I could remember, my exposure was so limited in Asia, was Bryan Adams, at that
He's
time.
Canadian. He's a Canadian. I got to put that out there.
And I could, the only song that I could remember was "Please Forgive Me." Like,
awesome.
But the key thing that I tell myself, like from that time, is just because I was different didn't mean that I was dumb. It felt like that at that time, where I was like, oh my God, like I don't know the food, I don't know the culture, I don't know, get the American jokes. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So talk to us about your journey of where did you go from there? You when you had that bit of, that aha moment where you realize, okay, wait a minute, just because I'm different, I'm not dumb. I bring variety of perspective. So what happened then?
Yeah, so I think there was a lot of learning that I had to do, right? And the first thing you do is with self-awareness. Fortunately or unfortunately for people like you and me, we do so much coaching and we have to eat our own dog food. And, I just started asking a lot of questions. And people started asking me, they would ask me things like, oh my God, your English is so good. Initially it would be like, that's like, I don't know, that's a backhanded compliment in some ways, right? Like, I didn't know they had like English speaking schools in the country where you grew up and things like that. But I really changed it, and I started approaching it more with curiosity, by understanding where they're coming from, instead of getting offended and getting all like, oh my God, and that really changed a lot of what I do now. So then I realized that I had to learn this, unlearn some of the things, right? Like, but also learn these new behaviors. Like America is so execution focused. They want to move fast. And in Asia, it's more strategic and very thoughtful and very community oriented and very caring. So I had to kind of blend both. And in a good way, I had exposure to both cultures, so I could form a beautiful blend that worked for myself.
That's awesome. So talk to me an example of a client that you worked with and what kind of things you've done with them to improve on, or to increase the level of diversity, equity, and inclusion at work.
Yeah. Let me think about, I have so many. One of the clients that I'm currently working with is I'm working with South Asian women for them, and that's the background that I have. And I think most of, and you and I were talking a little bit earlier about the whole well-being aspect, right? Diversity, well-being, leadership, all of this is connected. And I am coaching this group of women, to create that self-awareness. And I think it always starts with that. and their limiting beliefs and all of those things to show up as a better leader. And the question that I asked them yesterday, I was talking to them, and I asked them, like, where in life are you okay not to show up at 100%, right? Like, I think women are trying to conquer it all. So it's a very thoughtful, like, 6 months journey. In first part, I'm talking to them, I'm creating that self-awareness. And in the second part, we're equipping them, with more tools and techniques to rise as confident leaders.
I love that question. I'm sorry. I love that question. And so what are some of the answers that you're hearing from where is it in life that you're okay? You're okay with not being your 100% in that part of your life. What were some of the things that came up?
I know that very interesting. First was like a big silence. They were so shocked. They were like, we don't know. And then, they were talking about things like, oh, like I've started creating those boundaries for me, and I'm not like doing the extra work in the evening, and things like that, because they have little kids. Somebody was a new parent, who was still breastfeeding. There was another woman who was supporting, her parents in a big transition that they're going through their life, right? So I think I still don't think that women do it very intentionally, where you're like, okay, I am not going to show up 100 on 100 as a parent. Like, you and I don't do it. Like, leave South Asian women. I think women in general just don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
It just happens because they are so thinly stretched. But the idea is to be intentional and to not feel that guilt that we feel all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I do work around women leadership. I do work around awareness around D&I, for organizations where yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. And these are the different, and then I work on the whole strategy, right? Like starting from attraction, retention, because I've done a lot of behind the scenes. So I'm able to kind of tweak those processes and create that culture and mindsets, for the organizations.
That results in them being that much more inclusive, diverse.
Exactly.
And so I've actually heard the terms equity and equality used interchangeably. Do you agree with using them interchangeably, or is there a difference for our listeners' benefit? How could you define each and the differences or those nuances between the two?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And a lot of times I use that, in my workshops or my coaching sessions. I think equity is about ensuring that everybody can show up to life in equal capacity. Now, because we all come from different backgrounds and needs, we need different solutions. So actually the visual that I use, in my workshop is there's a tall person, there's a girl who's not super tall, and there's a person on wheelchair, and they're all trying to watch a match from behind a wall. Now, if you put them on an equal pedestal, they won't be able to see. The girl can barely see. The guy's, of course, at an advantage point because he's tall, and the wheelchair person has no access. So how do you create that platform that gives them equal access? When I'm coaching people, from different backgrounds, sometimes I ask them, like, why didn't you ask for help? And they're like, I didn't know that I could. If you approach that from their lens, how their upbringing is, or what their values are, or what they've been through, it's a different experience, where somebody else may say, I need help, so just creating that platform where everybody has not only equal access, but you keep into consideration their limitations and backgrounds and everything else that they've been through.
I think I know that image you're referencing, and it's like that standard box size for all three of them.
Yes.
And how it does nothing really to equalize and to neutralize their view, where if you adapt the boxes so that all of their head heights are all at that same height. Exactly. Now that is true equity. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. So you referenced really quickly the different stages that an organization goes through. What's the connection with DEI? So how important is DEI to high performance?
Yeah, I love that question. I think when I started the D&I journey, honestly, it was 15 years ago. I was working with Vodafone, and we were trying to, create a different process to support women there and all of that. And I feel like, when I was talking to male leaders, Asia is very, male dominated, and especially in telecom, which is high sales. Like they almost felt like it was a moral responsibility for them to do good, by promoting women or by creating or giving those opportunities. So I want to clarify for everyone, like there is no moral obligation, whether it's women, whether it's people of color, people, there is a business case for D&I. There is a clear business case, and most organizations didn't understand that then, right? Like you're attracting and retaining key high performing talent. That would clearly lead to high performance culture. It fosters innovation and creativity because you're thinking differently. It enhances decision making because you're getting diverse opinions from people. Because CSAT, your customers are diverse background, increased productivity and satisfaction. So there is a clear business case for diversity. And I think if there's nothing, post-pandemic, that's one thing that you and I would agree on. There's a clear business case.
And I even think for a high performer, like what if that it's a high performer who is feeling those feelings that you were talking about earlier, like that because it was so foreign to them and that no accommodation or no effort had been made to strategically integrate them into the organization and to minimize the impact perhaps of that diversity on their experience. What if it's a high performer in disguise, if you will, because they're hiding behind those feelings, those intrusive thoughts that they're dumb because they just don't get it, right? So I think not only there's a business case to be made from, through the business lens and the money that it can bring back, but I think it's about understanding whether or not you have some high performers who have yet to step up to the plate, who have yet to get that view we referenced, because they're hiding and guarded behind these feelings of not measuring up to that culture within that organization, right? So I think that alone is a business case as well, right?
Absolutely. Oh my God, you that's music to my ears, that what you're saying, and it makes so much sense, Laurie. A lot of times I tell my business leaders that if you don't value and tell your high performer that you are high performer and I'm going to help you and somebody else will, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Those high performers, if you don't have systems to identify them and to validate or to even challenge them more, because they need that crazy amount of challenge, for sure, that they're going to be shopping around. And definitely you need to bring them in and support them and provide them with that very curated training and development plan so that you're keeping them engaged permanently.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you had tips and tricks, what are some of the most common tips and tricks, those quick wins that you provide to organizations to improve in the DEI space?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say is start, with assessing where you are. As consultants, we do it day in and day out, right? Look at your ESAT surveys, look at the data of how many.
Your what survey? Sorry, I'm gonna.
Employee satisfaction survey. Thank you for calling me out on that. I love that. Yeah, we're so used to acronyms.
We're so used to our acronyms and our talent development lingo, right? So sometimes it's a struggle to not, but just for the benefit of the listeners who might not be in that space. Okay, so you want to look at your employee satisfaction surveys. You want to integrate, I imagine, questions in there as well, right?
Exactly.
That ask whether or not they feel like they are able to contribute to their workplace and that they feel fully valued and supported, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think everywhere, right? When you're attracting, are your JDs inclusive? Job descriptions.
There you go. Look at you again.
You got me. Are your job descriptions inclusive? The advertisements that you're putting out there, how does that resonate with the target audience, right, that you're trying to attract? I also, heard about this some rule where they say if 2 out of 3 resumes are people of color or different backgrounds, there's a fair chance still that person may not get picked up. So
you've heard that stat. Okay.
Yeah. And then looking at I also feel like a lot of times we're so focused on our employees, we feel like nobody else people who leave us, like ex-employees. Look at the exit data. What are they saying about feeling included? Look at the people you interviewed but didn't hire. What are they saying? Look at your culture surveys. Look at how your managers and leaders are showing up. So I would say that do that analysis, and then the whole life cycle needs work, which is a lot of work and an ongoing journey. How you're attracting talent, how you're developing them, what are the opportunities, sponsorship, mentorship programs for people of color, women? How are you assessing performance? I remember fighting in a performance discussion for a woman when I was sitting, and I could clearly see that there was something going on there where they didn't want to promote her, right? Like those kind of things where, this person is a woman in the sales role, those kind of typical mindsets. She's not going to do well. Oh, she has a family, who knows, like how much extra can she stretch and things like that. So I think looking at the whole life cycle and creating, those kind of, for example, are you integrating the processes and systems around them? Maternity policies, reintegration. When you're hiring women, are you promoting them, in the leadership roles, investing in them? So I think one is to also like create that ecosystem around these people to succeed through the entire life cycle.
Yeah, I think it's about, I love what you're saying there. And I agree 100%, Simmer. It's about kind of holding a mirror up to yourself initially as an organization to say, how inclusive are we? Something as mundane as, in your job descriptions, are there elements in there that you're requiring that are more of a nice to have, not a need to have, but in them, they're actually preventing certain applicants from applying because they feel like they don't fit the bill, like that's not inclusive, right? To make sure that you only have the must-haves on there. And providing that equal opportunity to everyone to apply. To your point about making sure that you recognize, are there some systemic barriers preventing, ascension to other roles for certain groups of our workers? Are there certain practices and procedures that are counter conducive to a fully inclusive workplace, and starting to shine a light on those, then developing, I'm hearing you develop your plan that maps throughout that entire journey with initiatives, and you kind of start to implement some quick fixes.
Absolutely. You're so right.
In terms of communication strategy, are there any recommendations that you typically make to communicate with and how to use, I guess, communications to improve the perspective of people and their perception, I suppose, of you as an organization relevant to DEI?
Yeah, I think when you talk about communication, it's pretty much like, how is, your brand kind of coming across to people in the market? I mean, I think one of the things that I did when I was interviewing for organizations, was doing a little bit research on them and seeing like what their policies are, what are some things that they're doing, is there good work-life balance or not? What's the culture? I think things like culture are it's so hard to kind of nail it down, right? But creating that brand or image where you do say that we value people of color, we create that environment for women to thrive. A lot of organizations, I think, are good at like showcasing, like even if they're doing a little bit. But I think a true data point for me is just to look at their leadership team, for example, and say like, hey,
so internally,
So I think not only, I mean, communication and coming across in the positive light is one part, but at the same time, also, moving those metrics in your organization. Like I met an HR leader who was like, did a lot of work around D&I, but there was no, like all the people reporting into her, there was not even a single person who was not white and not American. You know what I mean? Like, communication to me is also linked to authenticity, if you will, in some ways. Like when you're saying that you're doing something, like do it.
Exactly. I love that. And it's something that I also, I encourage strongly, that notion of, I use the concept of don't catfish your prospective candidate, right? So make sure that what you're showcasing on the outside is the reality of what's reflected on the inside, right?
Oh my God.
And so I'm hearing a similar, so communications, would you say that a lot of organizations have gotten really good at the external piece. So kind of showing and showcasing what they're doing to be inclusive externally. But where there's room for improvement, I'm hearing, is on the internal part to make sure that they're actually living, that story that they're putting outside the company.
I think so. I feel like it's a very long and arduous journey, right? It's not like you can do it in a day. And most organizations get stuck in the initial stage of like legally what we need to do, like California, for example. I'm in California and there are different laws and they're so worried about like, you and I were talking about like questions that you can ask in an interview or not. But I think if you truly want to make that impact, they're struggling in like integrating that truly as a part of their culture, which is a lot of hard work, right? Like, and I think you see organizations, one is like just the legalities of it, right? But some organizations now have, employee resource groups and things like that, where they're doing
I love it.
They have funding and, people are coming together, but being very intentional about like, what is the outcome that you're trying to drive, and not so much like, oh, we have Asian leader, you know what I mean? Like, just like as a part of their branding, oh, we have, employee resource groups, but what is the outcome that you're trying to drive? I think it truly thrives when you see the C-suite leaders taking a charge, and it's not just an HR kind of.
Yeah, it's not just a how should I say, like a passing thought. They're really embedding it in the systems. It's supported top down. Yeah. You're seeing that they're walking the talk, as they say, right?
Right.
So I love what you just said there. I like even just the employee resource groups, like involving and leveraging your people in not only developing that strategy, but also implementing it and helping them kind of have a say and contribute to how that DEI strategy lives within your organization. I love, love, love that. Thank you, Simmer. Is there any parting thoughts that you wanted to leave with our listeners or with leaders on how to be more inclusive? If you had one thing you could provide them as a tip.
Yeah, I think I would just say that move beyond the awareness level and approach things with curiosity and courage. I feel like a lot of times we feel like, oh my God, maybe I'll say something wrong. I don't know this. And, I think it's just because you're not in it doesn't mean that it's not your responsibility. I think if there's anything we've realized post-pandemic is that all of us are connected. We've all weathered the same storm in some ways. So I would strongly encourage leaders to stand up for each other, to have the courage, curiosity, and move beyond the awareness stage and get more into actions. How are you creating that safe space for your people to show up as who they are?
I love, love, love that, Simmer. And I love the notion of, rather than staying paralyzed in the fear of saying the wrong thing or not understanding, to approach it and take action from a curious position, like, help me understand. I recently had a conversation with someone and they were of a different religion, and I was really curious about their holiday and how they celebrate it. And I asked a bunch of questions, and we ended our meeting and we hung up, and I got a text like a half hour later, and she was saying, thank you. Thank you for being curious. Some people will just, skate around it, never ask a direct question because they don't really understand it, but they don't seem to want to understand it. But your questions made me feel like you were curious, and I was excited to share a part of my culture with you. And I thought that was really, really insightful. And that one scenario has motivated me to approach that next time with more confidence. So thank you, Simmer. Thank you for sharing your insight and your stories with us. Where can listeners, if they want to connect with you or if they want to hear more, where can they go to?
I think they can find me on LinkedIn. I also have a website. It's called Glintt with a double T, consulting.com. My name is Simmer Narula Singh. If they want to ping me on LinkedIn and have a cup of coffee, I'm very open, and it would be wonderful. Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, folks, I will be putting all of Simmer's contact information in the show notes. So make sure to check them out and to check her out if you want to continue the conversation. So thank you, everyone. Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guests, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.